Larry Barker joins me again here in the KRQE News 13 digital studio, here today to talk about his latest investigation to a problem that seemingly has continued for years at the Albuquerque Police Department, all related to officer overtime. Larry, thanks for being here.
You bet. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, well, and just for those folks who maybe are catching one of these kinds of segments for the first time, I'll run through it really briefly. This is a behind the story segment, a chance to speak to our investigative reporters about the work that they do, the process that they went through. As I know, Larry, you oftentimes take months for your investigations to come together. This one certainly seemed to fit that mold as well. It took a long time to put this together, right?
Yeah, you know, we started working on this last fall. I believe it was last September when we started working on this story. You know, it didn't come together until really just a couple of weeks ago.
So clearly a lot of process that went into this. And just as a reminder, if you want to catch other stories that Larry has worked on, including the one that we're going to talk about here today, you go to krqe.com/news/Larry-Barker. There, of course, are other ways to find stories. You can always type in KRQE Larry Barker in Google, but that's a good way to go straight to his landing page where you can find all of Larry's work. So to start with, Larry, about this story related to APD overtime to begin with, one thing I just wanted to really make clear from the get-go here was, what was your goal with this story? Why did you want to tell it, and what was the goal here?
Well, this is a story that had not been told. Nobody knew that this had occurred, and it was a big deal. And Chris, I'm just going to remind our viewers, I know many have already seen the story, but what you're looking at are all the different investigations since 2014. Right. There have been 7 prior investigations of APD overtime abuse. And this is a huge deal because it relates to taxpayers' money. Through the years, there have just been thousands and thousands of dollars misspent on officer overtime. So there have been all these audits and investigations trying to get a handle on APD overtime. And the department just simply has been either unwilling or unable to control it. This story is important because this is one of the largest documented cases of overtime abuse in recent years. We're talking about a very high-level scam. It went on in the chief's office at the very top of the department, and nobody noticed. And until our story aired, nobody knew that this had occurred. Right. So the department was not very upfront about this problem, and it was a heck of a problem.
And the problem that you really focused on is related to a single person in terms of who's clocking that overtime, right? It's Lieutenant Jim Edison. And can you just tell us again a little bit about what he did for the department? Here's a photo of him here.
Yeah, Lieutenant Edison was responsible for APD's COVID response. He was appointed to that position, worked out of the chief's office, and his job was primarily pandemic-related. He was coordinating testing, as you can see here, contact tracing. He compiled statistics. He handled emails, phone calls, questions about the pandemic and COVID-19, and it was a desk job.
Yeah.
So from the period of roughly April 2020 to roughly April 2021, he was working in that position, and while working in that position, he accumulated thousands and thousands of hours of overtime in that job, and virtually none of it was legitimate. Things like he would send an email to somebody at 3 a.m, outside his normal shift. He had basically a day shift Monday through Friday,
Right.
but he would be at home at 3 in the morning. He would send an email and then take 2 hours overtime. He would listen to a phone call would come in. It would go to voicemail. He would listen to the voicemail, forward it to somebody else, and then take 2 hours overtime because he listened to a voicemail. Things like that.
Yeah.
He claimed overtime practically for a full year, practically every single day, weekends included. He would take overtime, and his direct supervisor was the deputy chief, the number 2 person in the police department, and he signed off on every hour of that.
Wow. And you know, one of these things this brings me to, right? You mentioned all of the moments where how this overtime was explained or not explained, and you did that through a lot of public records, right? And I wanted to ask you specifically, when putting this story together, what made this different from, say, the audits in the past? Because we know that the audits cover a lot of the ground just generally about APD overtime and the problems there, but you went beyond those. What were the things you requested?
Right. You know, the documentation for this story was extensive. I mean, there were several thousand pages of records that we put together. You're looking at some of them right now. Timesheets and internal payroll documents. There's memos, there's emails, there's APD policies that we had to put together. So the documentation on this, it took a long time to compile this and then go through it and analyze it and look at where the problems were.
And of course, the IA files as well. Those were a big part of what you gathered too.
Absolutely. You know, the APD launched their own investigation through the Internal Affairs Department. This is an independent review of problems within the department, and their conclusion was that Lieutenant Edison was cheating on his overtime, and his supervisor, who was the deputy chief at the department, simply looked the other way. He signed off on it, and that was inappropriate too. Now, the IA investigation looked at a 2-month period in which Edison had cheated on his overtime. Okay. We expanded that. We looked at an entire year.
Okay.
So I'm not sure why APD's Internal Affairs limited their investigation to a 2-month period, but it was clear that Edison, the improprieties extended well over a 2-month period. So we expanded that investigation, which resulted in all this documentation that we had to put together. And that's really why it took so long to put this story together.
Yeah, certainly you went above and beyond those reports that we've kind of seen looping in the background video there, above and beyond the work that they did, and you looked more into what was going on over an extended period of time.
Sure.
You covered this in your story, but it just as a reminder to folks, this is the rules that were essentially violated or the violations that were picked up as a result of the internal affairs investigations, as I understand. So rules, regulations, codes of conduct were among some of the things that Lieutenant Edison was found to have violated. It brings me to my next question for you, was reaching out to Lieutenant Edison for comment. I know you mentioned in the story that I believe it was he did not respond to requests for comment. Just tell me about the process behind that.
Sure. Story is about Lieutenant Edison and his supervisor, who's Deputy Chief Smathers. But as it relates to Edison, we did, of course, we want his side of it. We want to find out what was going through his mind, what happened, what is his explanation for what he did. And so he was fired last year, I believe in October. So he's a private citizen, but we were able to reach him on a cell phone, and I told him that we wanted to talk to him. We would like to sit down and go over the overtime and this investigation and get his side of it, and we would like to do an interview with him. And he said he would think back about it and get back to us, and he did not.
I see. So yeah, you clearly had that conversation, knew what you were, the story you were telling, and did not get back to you. So very interesting there. You also spoke to Chief Medina in this story, Chief Harold Medina of Albuquerque Police. We do hear a bit from him as well as a counterpart of his, a deputy chief there. Can you just elaborate maybe a little bit more on what they told you? Because I know it is sort of covered there in the story. I think the vouching for Smathers is that, you know, he was truthful in the investigative process, and then Chief Harold Medina kind of goes on and says, we're really busy. But can you elaborate a little bit more about what was your interview like with, you know, these two top brass?
We did sit down with Chief Medina. I mean, he didn't try to hide or anything like that. He was willing to sit down and talk about this investigation. You know, and his perspective on it was that Jim Edison had cheated the department, and he was not truthful with his supervisor, and he was not truthful on his timesheets, and he's the bad guy here. And Chief Medina feels that he let down the department, and he was disciplined for it. Now, you know, there are really two issues here. One is Edison, and the second is Deputy Chief Smathers, whose job it was to supervise Edison and to look at his timesheets and approve them. And that was a problem. Internal Affairs found that Deputy Chief Smathers had violated rules, regulations, and codes of conduct by failing to properly supervise Edison and for approving overtime that was not justified. And he was disciplined for that. The discipline was there were 2 IA cases. In one case, he received a 1-day suspension. In the second case, he received a written reprimand. A number of experts that we spoke to outside the department were critical of that discipline. They felt that what Chief Smathers did and did not do was egregious, and that the discipline was not appropriate. He was protected, perhaps. That's what is alleged by some of the experts. We spoke to Chief Medina about Deputy Chief Smathers, and his point was that the executive staff of the police department are very, very busy. And one of the things he said was that approving time cards is, biweekly timesheets is not something that is not a priority for his executive staff. It's one of the things he said in the interview. He says that Deputy Chief Smathers took responsibility for his failures, and he acknowledged those, and he was disciplined, according to Chief Medina, appropriately for that.
Yeah,
that's what he said.
Yeah, well, and it brings me to this next point here. You know, you do put in your story there as well some perspective from a new city councilor, Councilor Luis Sanchez, who now sits in the seat once occupied by Ken Sanchez, and preceding that, or after that, it was Lon Senna for a couple years. Luis Sanchez elected in the most recent city election there. He obviously expresses some concern, but I'm curious from you, did you get a sense from Councilor Luis Sanchez there that he was willing to take this to another level? Because sometimes we do see councilors go on legislative action related to a problem if they think there is one. Did you get a sense of anything like that from Counselor Sanchez?
Sure, and let me just add here, because we went to Counselor Sanchez specifically because he has a unique perspective on the police department. He is a retired APD officer himself. I believe he retired as a acting commander.
Yep.
But I think he said he had 28 years with the Albuquerque Police Department. And so he has a unique perspective. He's been there. He understands the policies, the codes of conduct, so that's why we went to Councilor Sanchez.
Yeah.
And his point was, when we interviewed him, was the city council does have oversight responsibility for all facets of city government. And of course, the police department is an important public safety branch of city government. And the councilor has said that he is going to follow this up with the police department and make sure that taxpayers' money is being properly spent. And I think that's the bottom line for Councilor Sanchez, is to make sure that the operation of the police department is in compliance with the rules, regulations, policies, and codes of conduct, but also, do they spend taxpayers' money appropriately? He said that he is going to follow this up. He will take it up with the Albuquerque Police Department, with the leadership there.
Okay. Well, that is interesting, and we'll have to follow and see what ends up happening out of this. It's certainly a fascinating story to expose here, especially in that when you consider, I think, what you lay out in the beginning of the story, that this is certainly not a new issue for in many different facets and variations, but the overarching issue of overtime has persisted, lingered with APD for quite some time. So appreciate you bringing this story to light. Larry, is there a good way people can contact you if they got a question, comment, or a story tip?
You bet. Best way to contact us is through the website KRQE.com, and you can send us emails. Your concerns, your comments. We love to see them, and we do read everything, and many of those result in story ideas. So
yeah, absolutely,
we'd love to hear from viewers on that.
Larry, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Chris.